When we think of mummification, we usually think of immaculately preserved bodies uncovered in the desert sands of the Sahara. But another desert is home to a very different kind of mummy, a much older kind of mummy. That's right, the oldest mummies are not from Egypt. Now, we should start with a distinction between natural mummification and artificial mummification. Natural mummification is when soft tissue is preserved without human involvement. Bog bodies are an example of nature doing the work for us. Artificial mummification is when people manipulate the deceased to preserve soft tissue like skin and hair. Natural mummification has been happening for millions of years. Leonardo the Duckbill was mummified 77 million years ago, long before humans were around to wrap bandages. But artificial mummification began between 7 and 10,000 years ago in the Atacama Desert on the Pacific coast of South America. The Atacama Desert is one of the best places to preserve soft tissues naturally, with high altitude, dry climate, salt from the nearby coast, and plenty of arsenic in the soil. By the 5th millennium BCE, people of the Chinchorro culture had become the first people to artificially mummify their dead, over 2,000 years before the Egyptians. The Chinchorro were a group of egalitarian fisher people who lived in small coastal communities. They were likely the first settlers in the area of their world at the cross-section of the Atacama and the Andes nearly 10,000 years ago, lasting until about 1000 BCE. To mummify people, the deceased had all their flesh and internal organs removed and replaced with some sort of stuffing. Their bones were then articulated by tying them to sticks. Their skin was painted, a clay mask put over their face, and their hair reattached on a wig. There were two main styles of this mummification. The older black style was established by 5000 BCE, though potentially as early as 7800 BCE, only a few hundred years after the first signs of settlement. In this style, the skin was painted black, as the name suggests, and the mummies were stuffed with clay and ash. In the later red style, starting around 3000 BCE, mummies were painted red with more detailed masks and stuffed with plant matter, furs, and soil. We're able to distinguish between styles because the Chinchorro were seemingly indiscriminate in their mummification. There seems to be no social group or caste that saw special treatment, except children. Children, infants, and even fetuses show the most variation in mummification styles throughout the millennia, with a fully wrapped bandage style exclusive to mummified children. It has been suggested that the high arsenic levels of the soil spurred natural mummification, and that the Chinchorro people saw this and found ways to utilize it, eventually developing their artificial mummification practices. But the high amount of arsenic and consequent arsenic poisoning led to a high infant mortality rate. The start of mummification, artificial or inducing natural mummification, may have been used as a coping mechanism against death. Mummification may have been a method for Chinchorro people to keep dead children with them for longer, as, quote, there is evidence for display of some Chinchorro mummies for an extended period before reburial. This makes the story of the Chinchorro interesting, as the poison in the earth that killed the Chinchorro was also an agent in their preservation. The cause of their suffering is what allowed them to cope. As the Chinchorro people transitioned away from coastal fishing to inland agriculture around 1000 BCE, their mummification practices changed, but it seems never went away. The Andes saw near-continual mummification practices, from the Chinchorro through the Quillani, Tiwanaku, and Chiriyaba, and the Inca. The coastal Andes have seen mummification of human remains since potentially the settlement of humans, and sustained mummification practices until the decimation of indigenous cultures with Spanish invasion and colonization, which included the systematic destruction of mummified people to impose a new culture. This systematic destruction means that our record of Inca and other contemporary cultures' mummification practices is pretty small. We have to rely in part on testimonial of conquistadors, who reported meeting a king who had been dead, apparently for decades, so complete and well preserved with a certain bitumen that they appeared to be alive. Like the Chinchorro, the Inca had their king on display, in the open, complete with open, lifelike eyes. They'd used gold to back the eyes to be reflective, just like ours. Some Inca mummies seem to have been sacrifices, mummified naturally on top of cold, arid mountains. Because of the elevation and the metal offerings placed on them, they often show damage from lightning strikes. But the Inca were an empire in their own right, and we see smaller, outlying towns conquered by the Inca who changed their funerary practices to the mummification styles of the Inca, possibly to ingratiate themselves. Many of these mummies are hidden in caves, either as part of the mummification process or to hide them from oncoming conquistadors. Since the Chinchorro were so much older, and since they engaged in mummification for everyone, we have a much better record. So the oldest mummies in the world are not just bodies preserved, but a people and a culture preserving, even through colonization. Which is a great reminder that when we are talking about mummies or any human remains, we are talking about people. People with the same complexities and full lives that you or I lead. It's what makes the forcible changing of funerary practices under the Inca or the mass destruction under Spaniards so devastating. And what makes the Chinchorro families bringing in a recently lost family member back into their home for a last round of goodbyes such a deeply human story.